Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Salam, hello, bonjour, welcome to you all, peace to you all. I'm Adnan Hussein, historian of the medieval Mediterranean and Islamic world at Queen's University, and welcome to my show. And also, I have to say that this is a very special episode because it's going to be a collaboration with my other venture, the podcast Guerrilla History. Unfortunately, my co-host Henry Hakamaki can't make it today, but we will make sure, listeners, that you get a chance to hear this wonderful conversation coming up. As many of you who are listeners to Guerrilla History would know, we very often have had a series where we've talked with not only historians who have studied the past and radical movements and revolutionary struggles, but we've had an opportunity occasionally to speak with somebody who was a witness to and participant in those periods of historical change and in those dramatic events. And we're very lucky today to have someone in exactly that position. So without further ado, I would like to introduce and welcome Elaine Mokhtefi, who is an American Algerian activist, writer, journalist, and translator, who is author of this wonderful book, Algiers, Third World Capital, with the subtitle Freedom Fighters, Revolutionaries, Black Panthers. I mean, what could be more exciting than that? Elaine, thanks so much for joining us on the show.
Oh, I'm glad to be here. I hope I can answer the questions properly.
Oh, don't worry. I think this, firstly, I want to encourage everyone to go read the book. And this conversation that we're having hopefully will give them a little bit of a taste of what you tell about in this amazing narrative about yourself and your life, because you are a witness to and participant to some really major shifts and events in a very exciting period, in the particularly the post-war period. And so I wanted to just ask you a little bit before we get into talking about Algeria and Algiers and your relationship to the anti-colonial struggle and to the post-colonial country in its early period of its post-colonial history when it got its independence from France. I wanted to ask you, just so listeners and watchers can understand a little bit of your political background beforehand, I was very intrigued to learn that you were an internationalist from very early on and that you had participated in United World Federalists. And I just was wondering, because I don't think a lot of listeners are very familiar with that, what kind of an organization it was like, how did you join, and what was the organization all about?
Well, the organization was about the creation of a world government. We were just out of the Second World War. This was 1945. And the organization was started by students during the war, actually, and very quickly caught on. It was the idea of world peace was really transient at the time, and various organizations, peace organizations, were created, and the United World Federalists flew like crazy. I mean, it was gained membership overnight as soon as the war ended. And it had two sections. It had what was called an adult section, which was really community leaders, and a student section. And I was a student in those days at a place called the Latin American Institute of New York. It was a Spanish language program, essentially. And someone came and spoke to us about the World Federalists, and I immediately joined. The idea of a world organization for peace and justice seemed so natural at the time. And it was a very, gathered a lot of students, and I finally ended up by working actually for the organization and becoming the student director. And then McCarthyism set in. And we were immediately accused of being too radical, being communists, and so on and so on. And within the organization, there was a tendency to lower our goals to meet with approval. Sort of what's happening today with the Trump administration. And the students were considered the most radical elements. And so they finally kicked us out of the organization. And so we created a new organization. And we were for really for the more than just world government. We emphasized decolonization, justice, world justice, and so on. And however, you know, without the backing of the adult organization, it was difficult to stay in existence, and it lasted about 3 or 4 years. Our organization was called World, and so when we seemed to be failing too, because of lack of financial aid to continue organizing and traveling and speaking and so on, I went on a sort of an investigation tour of France, of Europe essentially, but aimed at France. And so I took off there. That's where I met Algerians and learned about their problems and saw the beginnings of the Algerian War.
Right, right. I do want to ask you about that, of course, and so much of the book is really about that centrally. And you know, I do need to just point out that my co-host Henry Hakamaki also sent in a message saying that he vividly remembers reading this book a couple of years ago during the pandemic, right before he moved to Russia. That's in fact where he is now. And he really
Oh,
would have enjoyed being part of this conversation, and he loves the book. Um, and the story, you know, you give begins really with your departure to France, and then you start filling in some of the background and your first impressions of France after the war were quite interesting. You know, it seems like it was really going through a lot of inability to really deal with its own history, of many people who had been collaborating, you know, with the Nazi regime, and that was uncomfortable for people to really discuss or talk about. So it seemed like they wanted to sort of bury that. And the other issue seemed to be what you were alluding to, that there were a lot of Algerians who were colonized by France and were being, you know, their country was being occupied and exploited, but that also many of the workers who had come to metropolitan France in places like Paris, where you were living, were also being completely marginalized and subject to racism. And so, is that how you got involved in the Algerian freedom struggle? Maybe you could tell us a little bit about how you came to know about the problems that you know, Algeria and Algerians were suffering under settler colonial rule by France.
well, maybe I should remind everyone that France had a 10-year anti-colonial war with Indochina. That is to say, Laos, Cambodia, and Vietnam. It lasted from about 1945 to 1954. It was about a 10-year war, and France was defeated, heavily defeated at Dien Bien Phu in 1954. And this that war was also heavily financed by the United States, to the point where American pilots even piloted planes in that war. Then Algeria started their war in 1954. Started as a kind of low caste quality, not admitted to for years by the French. They considered it just a manifestation. That's the way they sold it to the world. But actually, I mean, they were heavily at war. And again, supported by the United States with weapons and their politics at the UN and so on. And Algerians actually fought for almost 8 years before finally France gave up and admitted defeat. Admitted defeat, it was obviously a defeat. They probably would never admit it. But that's basically what happened. And as far as I was concerned, I was very much aware of the Algerian war starting, and there were demonstrations in Paris, which I went to, and so on. But actually, I only really got personally involved when I joined the staff back in the United States of the Algerian office. It was an office that was dedicated to getting the resolution passed by the United Nations.
Right, to recognize Algeria as an independent
Yes,
nation.
well, they didn't recognize Algeria. They didn't recognize the need for independence until 1961. Algeria set up a very small office in New York in 1955, just after the beginning of the war. And that office maintained, it was a very small office, and it did keep journalists and delegations to the United Nations aware of what was happening in Algeria. And unfortunately, neither the United Nations nor the opinion in America actually took hold of their information. But finally, in 1960, the United Nations finally passed a resolution against colonialism. And then a year later, they finally recognized the need for independence of Algeria and the support of that independence. Quite an amazing story.
Yes, and you were
France liberated about 20 colonies in Africa in order to maintain Algeria as a dependent. And even those countries, generally speaking, did not support a resolution on Algerian independence because they were held under France's strong hand.
Yes, I recall actually reading some of Frantz Fanon's articles in Al Mujahid decrying some of these countries that were given nominal independence within the umbrella of French interests in West Africa, and that their currency, there was a new currency that they had to use that was basically dependent upon, and all the fiscal and monetary policy would be kind of coordinated and organized by France. And he was very keen to make a distinction between the process of real decolonization and the struggle for national sovereignty that was taking place in Algeria compared to these kind of neo-colonialist games. So when you bring that up, that really
Yes.
reminds me of that period. But I wanted to ask you, because you were very involved in these efforts working with the office, the Algerian office in New York. What kind of work were you doing, and what kind of environment was it? I mean, New York, where the UN was located, of course, would be the place for these international political efforts at recognition through the UN and so on. But I also got the sense from your telling of how much um, interaction there was with anti-colonial movements around the world and new post-colonial nations that were also trying to collaborate and cooperate, and how the Algerian mission was trying to seek support from them. And it reminded me, although you didn't discuss it very much in the book, I don't know if you mentioned it, but of course that 1955, the very same year that the Algerian, struggle became, was launched in a militant way by the FLN, is also, of course, the Bandung Conference, the Afro-Asian Conference, where you start to have the emergence of a third world block of nations that actually sees itself needing to collaborate somehow. So you were there in New York, kind of at the heart of where all of these efforts, came together diplomatically for at the UN. And I was just curious, what kind of work were you doing, and what was that atmosphere like collaborating with these
We
groups?
were a very small organization. We had powerful outlets, but we were a very small organization, 5 people actually.
Mm.
Uh, 3 Algerians and 2 Americans. The Algerians were all very good English speakers, and so they were capable of passing the message in French and Arabic and in English. And we were, of course, supported by most of the Arab nations at the United Nations. I had a pass to go into the UN from the Tunisian government, and the other members of the staff had passes from other Arab countries. And so we could go in and out, and we could listen to the debates. We could contact delegations and talk to them, give them literature. And that was our main job, was creating and giving literature out to the delegations. Our major exercise was really to get the United Nations to pass a resolution.
Mhm.
And delicate, it was a rather delicate time also, because we were trying to get United States support, but that was much more difficult. And at one point, the heads of our office, Mohammed Yazid and Abdul Chandali, went to Washington actually and tried to sort of work their way into the State Department and talk to people, and were told not to come back. And then finally, about 61, some secret talks were arranged by the State Department. What was interesting was in 1958, I believe, John F. Kennedy, as a senator from Massachusetts, stood up and made a tremendous speech in favor of Algerian independence. He had strongly attacked France for being at war during the Second World War on the wrong side, being at war for 10 years in Indochina, and now being at war for 4 years by then, because it was 1958 he made this speech. That was a quarter of a century of war, and most of it was supported by the United States. So it was a very powerful speech, and I think it contributed to many events that happened later. when Algeria became independent, Ben Bella, who was the president at the time, took off for the United Nations, was invited to the White House, and had there's a famous little film showing him with Kennedy, and in a very casual and warm atmosphere, and that was heartwarming also. And yeah, and I forget what else you asked me, but at any rate, that was, we operated in very restricted and a very restricted atmosphere, mind you. At Bandung, that was the first international meeting where Algerian representatives were present.
Right.
And Bandung, as they support, they wrote a resolution in support of Algerian and of a change in France's attitude towards the whole affair. And it was after that that Yazid and someone else went to the United Nations and tried to set up an organization in New York, and they did in 1955.
Mm-hmm.
But all of that is part of history now.
Yeah, no, that was very important, and a lot was happening in those few years. A lot of different changes were taking
There
place.
was also the trip that Tito made in 1960 to the United Nations to set up the non-aligned movement.
Right.
And yes, that was, he was a very strong supporter also of Algerian independence. There have been two marvelous films made about the photographer that Tito sent into the Algerian war zone, and who stayed for 3 years inside Algeria filming every day. And marvelous documents that showed the buildup of the Algerian army and its effectiveness, its competence, things that were hidden from the public.
Right. That's so interesting that you mention, these films and making of films and newsreels and documentaries and getting footage seems very important. You even talk quite extensively about the significance of, I think it was the Porto Pack or some kind of like very, a handy portable film, recorder that needed less, less people to operate and could be taken, by somebody to carry it. Much like, the modern video recorder made it easy for correspondence, news correspondence, but this is an early stage of it. And it reminded me that you were very attuned in your book. I think partly must be because you worked in so many facets of media, journalism, and communications as a translator to link people and serve as a, somebody who could translate between French and English. But also as a journalist who was reporting. You talk about the conference that you attended in Cuba and sending back these reports. And you worked, it seems, also, I mean, I'm sure we'll get to all of this, but since we're talking about media and film and things, I wondered if maybe you might just talk a little bit more about how important and significant the political work of communication. Well, we take it so for granted now with social media and all of this.
Well before this period, yes, we're blazing trails. Cleaver was of course, he was the Minister of Information of the Black Panthers, and he was in tune with all of this. And when he saw the Portapac, he was absolutely amazed, had to get a copy. It was a way of recording and sending the recordings out, and practically instantaneously. And this was unknown at the time. It was difficult. But the Panthers, by the way, even managed to set up a system by which the Portapac films were given to someone on air at France and brought overnight to the United States.
Wow.
And shipped immediately to someone in Philadelphia. Yes.
So that they could
Who
be disseminated from there. Yeah.
first the document to the Black Panther Party. Yeah, it was quite amazing.
That is amazing.
These were revolutionary times
Yes.
for
Yeah.
communication. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, and it seems like it was very important to have these alternative, even then, now everybody talks about the importance of alternative media versus mainstream media. At that time period, there was so little of what you would call the mainstream media. It was the big newspapers, a few TV channels, and the radio. Of course, radio was very important. And of course, we even have, that's another wonderful essay by Frantz Fanon in, Dying Colonialism, right? In English, the translation of the title is that as an essay about the radio and how important it was as this kind of transformative,
So important,
people
but so
moving from
difficult.
just listening to silly, things and music from his perspective, things that maybe might have been enjoyable, but they weren't like politically helpful and organizing, to suddenly it becoming a major tool where a peasant, in the reef can be listening and understanding, hey, what's been happening, in Indochina, and the French are, losing at Dien Bien Phu, and then this kind of giving inspiration, for their own struggle. So this mass media and communications, you were there at the cusp of when these kind of changes, and the information war was so important, as well as the battlefield war. I mean, and so I'm just fascinated by your impressions of how important this was, and all the kind of work that you were doing in this field.
In I think it was in 1957. Yeah, 1957. The Algerians themselves realized they were being blocked information-wise, and so they invited individual journalists into the Maquis, into the war zones, and 4 Americans actually went, and one of them was a very good friend of mine, Catherine Updegraff, and actually 4 Americans went into Algeria secretly and took photos, came out and tried to write articles and photos and so on, with no success. It was all blocked. It was all blocked, and there's afterwards, very rarely that they were able to get into women's clubs or something like that and make that kind of contact. But the major outlets, information outlets in the United States, ignored the really everyday activity of the Algerian war machine.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Well, I mean, in a way, we were just talking about how important it was to try and get the information out, um, and the new techniques that were becoming available at that time, and how important they were. In a way, it makes me wonder about today. Two things. I mean, one, there's no shortage actually of the information now. If you want to see what's happening in Israel's genocidal assault on Gaza, we have all of these images, but that hasn't necessarily also, I mean, it has had a huge impact, but it hasn't necessarily meant that these Western governments, for example, or even the governments in the Arab world, are willing to take decisive action to do something, kind of serious about it. But also, the other thing that it reminds me of is that you just mentioned these four American journalists who were intrepid and, were willing to go into the war zone. I've been a little surprised, and I wonder what you think about it, that there hasn't been more attempts from media around the world to try and get into, to get images of Gaza, to get into, and, part of it is, of course, that they're very deferential to the Israeli military. But secondly, is when you see how many journalists, at least Palestinian journalists inside Gaza, have been killed, even you could
Yeah.
say assassinated. In fact, even just yesterday, an Al Jazeera journalist. And maybe that's one reason why there aren't kind of mainstream and external media workers and journalists reporting on the situation.
Oh, yes. Very, well, some tried and
Mhm.
during the Algerian War, and we know that many tried here in the war against Gaza, Israeli genocide. I think there's close to 100 journalists
I
have
think
been.
the number who have been killed is a little bit in excess of 200 now, apparently.
Oh,
Yeah.
it,
Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
of
Yeah.
course, yeah, it's part of the genocide,
Yeah. Yeah.
essential part of the genocide. Yeah, to keep
Well,
people from
that's
writing
right.
it. I
That's
mean, this we've also feel so helpless. It's overwhelming, the feeling we have for Palestine, and a lot of it has to do with the fact that we are powerless. Yeah,
Well, that's right. That's one reason why this history is so fascinating to me, because although there were a lot of problems that developed, and things didn't necessarily turn out to creating the world that it seems that people hoped for, that were struggling for, that you were working for. But nonetheless, there was a hope and a confidence that change was possible. And the kinds of people that you met in this kind of international world of anti-colonial and anti-racism, activists, um, is a kind of network that I don't see existing now. But I wanted to ask you a little bit about it, because I notice that today many, many more people are reading Fanon avidly because they see settler colonialism as the key problem in the Israel Palestine, the occupation of Palestine. And they think of him as one of the key and important thinkers who really understood how racism and oppression worked in colonialism. Um, and you were somebody who, met Fanon, worked alongside him in that era. Um, Even as I recall from your book, you tell of an evening, dancing with Fanon. And so I really wanted to get your impressions. About him and about the significance of his thinking from your own personal perspective, having lived, worked, and fought, for Algeria's freedom together.
yes. Well, I actually met him in Accra, in Ghana, where he had his office. He was sent to Africa as the representative of the Algerian liberation movement, of the government, provisional government of Algeria, and Nkrumah had invited them to set up an office. He had just been elected president of Ghana, and I was the organizer of a conference at the University of Accra, and he was one of the invited speakers. And so we met, and we became friends. And it was him, Mohammed Sanoun, and myself. Mohammed Sanoun was the representative of UJEMA, the Algerian student organization, and during the war. And so we became kind of a political organization ourselves, the three of us, and we would attempt to get resolutions passed by this organization, the World Assembly of Youth, and we were rather successful. We also joined forces with someone from the Congo, the Minister of Youth from the Congo, who was killed alongside Lumumba. And we're everywhere talking about colonialism and talking about the Algerian war. Then we're all three of us, Mohammed and Fanon and myself, we're very active politically. And in those days, you see, conferences lasted for several weeks, not for several days. So this went on and on. And then when I went back to the United States and joined the Algerian office, later on, he arrived in Washington with leukemia. And since he was a doctor, he knew very well where he was at medically at all times. And when we were informed in New York that he had arrived in Washington, I was the only person in New York in the office who knew him. So they used to send me down on weekends to Washington to see him, to make sure that he was all right, that he didn't need anything, and so on and so on. And so he obviously knew where he was at. And it was a very emotional kind of contact that we had, because it's difficult to watch a man die, and especially when he was so knowledgeable. But at any rate, he stated over and over again how much he missed his comrades from Algeria. His comrades from Algeria were mainly people who were heading up armed units within the country, and he felt their absence tremendously, and he felt his need for being attached to that struggle. It was very important to him. It kept his mind working. It kept him alive.
Yeah. It's such a shame that he wasn't able to see Algeria's freedom and spend time there in the post-colonial new nation that was being forged. But you did.
It was not long afterwards.
That's right. It wasn't long after. That's right. That the accords were signed and Algeria became its a free and independent country. But you did spend quite a bit of time in this new Algeria, which I find an amazing choice. You had been working in New York, advocating on behalf of recognition of their independence and on behalf of diplomatically and politically. But once that struggle was achieved, you decided to go and help build the new country. Maybe you could tell us a little bit about what that was like, both exciting, but also I'm sure very daunting. There were so many challenges faced and the way in which the French left after such a devastating period of brutal warfare and destruction that they had caused, also the way they left was, much like, it
I,
reminds me a lot of like what happened with Haiti. The rebellion, the slave rebellion fought for their freedom. They managed to achieve it, and then, but as part of the negotiation, they were saddled with the debt for the costs and the so-called losses that France had. So it just really
then
hamstrung Haiti, and something similar in some ways seems like, there was a very devastating way in which France left the free Algeria.
I guess about 1 million people left Algeria. Yeah, it was a country that had been devastated in many ways. On independence, Algerians were 95% illiterate after 132 years of French colonialism. That's very meaningful. And it was also, it also made recreating a country, an independent country, much more difficult because there were so few people who were trained, who were schooled, and so on. And people did come from all over, from the Middle East, even from France. Um, there were people of practically every nationality who came, who looked for a way of contributing something. And it was a very exciting time. But it was, there was also another aspect that was very important, was that the Algerians were very conscious of the fact that others needed help. And so they were helping out with liberation movements all over Africa and even outside of Africa, in Latin America or Asia, to set up their own, to supply their own organization, give them training and so on. Even someone like Nelson Mandela trained with the Algerian army during the war, and during the Algerian War. And when he went back to South Africa, that was when he was arrested. It was quite amazing. Not only during the war did they do training, but after the war, they continued to train liberation movement soldiers, and they offered space and help to the liberation organizations to do propaganda work and so on. And they helped them with travel documents as well as with information. And we often had talks from different liberation movements on the Algerian radio, on the Algerian television, in the newspapers, and so on. It was a really very active and very pro-independence spirit that was there at the time. It was very exciting.
Yeah, yeah, I get the sense of
That
that
was
from your
very
book, and
exciting.
that's why you called it, I think, Algiers' third world capital, is because
Yeah,
people from across the third world came to Algeria because they were so supportive of
yes,
anti-colonial struggles around the world and of the kind of collective project of trying to bring up the global South. So it became a place where you talk about like all these different leaders of resistance movements, leaders in some of the successful ones would still come to Algeria for having a place where they could meet and gather and talk. And you also talk about
Ukraine
the
also.
history of the African Union. Also that Algeria was very involved with all of that. I'm wondering what else you recall from that era that made it such an exciting place to be if you were interested in
Okay.
anti-colonial work.
It was extraordinary, and it contributed really tremendously. Then it sort of peaked in the All African Cultural Festival that took place in, I think it was 1969. And people from all over Africa, from practically every independent country, and from about 6 liberation movements, all arrived in the city of Algiers and gave performances, sang and talked and danced and put on plays and so on for about 10 days in Algiers. That's when the Black Panthers had a storefront on one of the main thoroughfares of Algiers, where they gave out literature, made talks, even put on films every single day during the festival. It was quite extraordinary at times.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
can imagine Algiers was the place to be those 10
All
days.
right.
I mean, it sounded absolutely marvelous and exciting.
Wonderful
Um,
musicians like Archie Shepp,
mhm.
Nina Simone. It was fabulous. It was absolutely fabulous.
Yeah,
And at the end, there was an explosion of fireworks. And Archie Shepp even went down into Algeria and made a film with local musicians of the Tuaregs in the south of Algeria in the Sahara Desert. And we even talked about that during the festival and afterwards. It is quite amazing.
yeah, yeah. So this was the Pan-African Cultural Festival that
Yes,
you were
Pan
very
African Cultural
instrumental,
Festival.
yeah, in
And,
organizing.
yes, Algeria felt very strongly African at the
Mhm,
time,
mhm.
and wanted to show that it was an African country, not only a Middle Eastern country, but it was definitely an African country, and it contributed to African identity. Yeah.
That's interesting. I mean, I think now there's been a lot more of a sense of regional kind of difference and separation but that pan-african vision forged in this anti-colonial collaboration seems to have been very strong. It reminds me even that Nasser, for example, who I think was probably less engaged in a direct way than the Algerians were in these pan-Africanist
Yeah.
pursuits, nonetheless in his own book, on the revolution, talked about Egypt being not only an Arab country and an Islamic country, but also an African country. And so these ideas of Pan-Africanism seem to have been very important and vibrant at the time. Um,
Yes. 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 There was a definite tendency to prove that one was not only North African but African. That was that. Yes, it was an important level on the intellectual level. There were alongside the festival. There was actually a meeting of intellectuals of the different African countries who expressed their resolution to be more political on a cultural level.
mhm.
The, culture was political, uh, very important now at the time.
Yes, yes,
Um,
fascinating.
time also today.
Yeah, well, absolutely. I mean, I think there's a big legacy from those connections that were forged at the time of thinking that we had to have a new philosophy, we had to new political theory, we had to invent new ideas to express the new world that people were trying to build. So very exciting,
Yes,
culturally and intellectually, this period. You mentioned a little bit about the Black Panther Party, that their arrival to Algeria, because it was seen as a place where you could be welcomed and accommodated, one of the few places and where you might get some resources and be able to get travel documents, and so on, that they arrived around the same time as this festival, and were participate and ended up participating in it. But much of the next several years of your time in Algeria, while you were doing other work, press work, and in other capacities as an employee, of the Algerian state and government, is that it seems like you were essentially the liaison and contact for the Black Panthers for everything that they needed done. It seems like without you, I'm not sure what they would have done in Algeria. They didn't know French. They didn't know how the country worked and how to navigate it. Can you tell us a little bit more about what
They
it
were
was like?
very unprepared. Yes, they were
Yeah.
unprepared. The Cubans sent Eldridge just telling him that he was going to be welcomed to Algeria, but it wasn't actually so. They had not informed the Algerian government that they were sending him, that they were shipping him out. But at the time, they arrived at a time when it was very easy to contact people and so on. And luckily, I was informed very early on that they had arrived. And I knew the person in the FLN setup who was in charge of liberation movements, and I got in touch with him immediately, and he immediately said, "Tell them that they're welcome here." And so they immediately set about establishing themselves and giving a press conference to announce their arrival and so on. It was all very exciting because they at that time, the Black Panther Party hadn't lost its steam yet. It
Hmm.
was still a very active and well-heeled, well thought of movement in the United States. And it was only later that it started to deteriorate. But at that time, it was still a very active movement and was exciting. Yes, several people came immediately and set up with Eldridge Cleaver and his wife, Kathleen. Yeah, and
Yeah.
the Algerians gave them actually gave them state-owned property to
Hmm.
inhabit, gave them travel documents. It was quite amazing. And so even tickets when they were wanted to travel elsewhere for different congresses or meetings and so on. Yeah, it was a real aid. It wasn't just a resolution.
Right.
Yeah.
And I mean, they were also even, as you said, given something that they would call the embassy, for the Black Panthers, and were recognized eventually, I think, partly through some of your connections and requests on their behalf to secure official status as a liberation movement, which is like being recognized as a nation, a national leadership in exile, as it were. And so that's really quite something. And it gave them a
Yeah.
lot of institutional status from which to be able to continue to operate and make
Yeah.
communiques and do real political work. That's
So it was a difficult time. It was a difficult time for them, and it was difficult to operate in English
yeah.
when they were in a country where everyone spoke Arabic and French.
Mhm.
And that was my main purpose, was being the crossover between the two, because I spoke both French and English. And but then they gradually got on for themselves. They all learned some French, and Kathleen did very well as a translator, and it was quite amazing. Yeah.
Mm, mhm. Yeah, she seemed like a very impressive woman. I mean, you talked about the tour that you took back in the United States after the split had happened, when there was a need to, try and reconstitute the organization to some extent. promote the message and connect with the anti-war movement that was really taking big shape during that period of the late 60s and early 70s against the Vietnam War. And you talked, I think, in the book about how impressive she was once you saw her in her element as a speaker, as a
Oh yeah,
activist.
she was great. She could really lay it on them. Yeah, she was amazing. And yes, I had not seen her in action before that. I mean, only seen her as sort of the secretary of the organization in Algiers and discreet and so on. But there, I really saw her out in the open, and she was an amazing speaker and had amazing contact with the audience. Yeah, yeah.
One of the reasons,
Unfortunately, the organization that they tried to set up was an organization of information.
Mhm.
Information from all the countries around the world that they had been in action with in their time in Algeria and had a good relationship with, and who were unknown in the States. And so it was kind of a clearing setup where they would take it, they hoped to take information from around the world, put out bulletins and inform people and so on. But it didn't, unfortunately, it didn't take off.
yeah,
We did our
yeah,
best, but it didn't take off. But
right.
it was an exciting trip.
Yeah,
Wow.
yeah, yeah. I mean, that's so interesting. There were so many challenges, and of course, is a little bit different from some of the other kinds of struggles where you have colonists from outside who are a minority against the indigenous majority population. And so, in a lot of these freedom struggles, it was a matter of activating the indigenous population and organizing them. That spelled the end of colonialism, but the struggle in the US, of course, was kind of complicated. But what seems interesting about the Black Panthers, and I wonder, since you were so closely involved with them and heard a lot about their analysis of the situation for African Americans in the US, and were intimately, of course, connected with the liberation movement against settler colonialism in Algeria. That what seemed interesting about the Black Panthers, and maybe one of the things that made them such a dangerous organization to the US state, was that they had this radical kind of analysis where they applied kind of colonialism and an anti-colonial sort of struggle, at least elements of it, in their analysis of the Black community's
They were very
situation.
open. They were very open about their support of Palestine,
Mhm.
about their opposition to the war in Vietnam. At one point, Eldridge even tried to speak to soldiers on the border of Vietnam to tell them to react and so on. But yes, it made them got them very involved with the international things that they had ignored before. Had they had either they hadn't known about it or that they had been overwhelmed with the struggle within the United States, getting people to follow them, and they became openly solidarity oriented when they worked in Algeria. It was very interesting to see. Yeah.
Yeah, I wanted to. You've been so generous with your time. So I just had a couple of other questions and topics to raise with you. One comes and was sent in from my co-host Henry Hakamaki, who noticed in reading, that there were a lot of personal sacrifices in various ways that somebody has to make to be committed to these revolutionary movements. And he noticed that, there were a lot of periods where you have to be, and others had to be separated from their partners, from people who they love. And he was interested in how do committed revolutionaries maintain their political fight and commitment in the face of, the sacrifices. One might say not only the sacrifices of being apart from loved ones, but also the risk and the danger. Um, these aren't easy to be involved in these struggles, and so we were just
Oh, we
interested
were
in.
young, that's one thing. We were young. And also we didn't see physically see the buildup of reactionary government in the United States. We didn't feel it the way we, for example, are feeling it today.
Hmm.
Uh, and uh, being activating, being an activist, or showing one's solidarity for movements had its pleasures also. You felt keyed up. You felt that you were participating in something that was bigger than you, and it was worth the sacrifice. In fact, we didn't think in terms of sacrifice. It's just in terms of being helpful, of giving out. Quite amazing how generous we were. I they don't mean by me, but uh, all sorts of people from different walks of life gave amazing things to the movement. If you could, yes, I mean, it was a movement. Mhm.
Yes, yeah, yeah. I noticed that in your account. There were a lot of times that you gave also to your time and energy and support and help to people who came through Algeria during that time that you lived there. But at eventually you ended up being having to leave Algeria, not through your
Yeah.
choice, but political circumstances in the state changed, and it no longer was possible for you to stay, and you had to move and spend some years in France, and then later back in the United States. But I noticed that you still maintained political commitments. Maybe you weren't as actively involved in a revolutionary kind of project of building a new post-colonial state like you'd been in Algeria, but you still kept engaged with a lot of political resistance and movements. And I'm just wondering, if maybe you want to talk a little bit about that, but also, I mean, I think we've been reflecting at least a few times in our conversation about how much things have changed. And you just were saying that, under the current administration, and one could say even under Biden, but also especially under Trump, is that, the forces of reaction seem to be pretty oppressive. I'm wondering, what do you take from that history? Um, and how have you maintained your political commitments, after your exciting time in these important movements that transformed history, but in your later life you still have maintained some political commitments. What's that been like, and how do you reflect on that time and how things have changed?
Well, my heart is open to Algeria. I feel as though it's part of me. And so uh, I'm not judging as much as I would normally. And we now have a situation in the United States where one of my dearest causes, and a cause that's very close to Algeria, Palestine, is being stripped to nothing.
Mm.
It's unbelievable. And Algeria has always been very pro-Palestinian, extremely so, because the Algerians have the very clear idea that Palestine is facing a similar struggle to theirs with France. And I do remember during the 68 war, Algerians was out in the street literally crying, tears rolling down their face when they heard the news uh, about Palestine. And it's very emotional because it's very definitely a part of their own struggle. And I think it's maintained until today. It's the same today. It's and what else to say? There's such strong sentiment involved. Yeah, total
Yes.
identification. It's real identification. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Uh, yeah, I feel very definitely uh, part of that attitude and sentiment and political initiative, whatever I could do. Yeah,
Yeah.
it's a heartrending.
It is. It's a very difficult time to feel so helpless, which is why I think it's important that we keep talking about it. We keep doing things. We keep showing our solidarity every way that we can. Because if you just, uh, passively witness these horrors, it's really can be
Horrors,
so devastating. Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. It's unbelievable. Uh,
Well, I know you've been so generous, with your time already. I don't want to keep you
yeah.
too much longer. Maybe just one last thing. You concluded your book. Actually, interestingly, you went back in time even before the main kind of story that you talked about, that's focused and centered on Algeria and the liberation struggle there. You went all the way back to your childhood and filled in this kind of impression. And I wonder if that's because coming back to the United States, it reconnected you, of course, with your the full life story and your family and background. And you talked a little bit then about, in this final sort of chapter, about growing up. As a Jewish American and the kinds of racism and anti-Semitism and exclusion that existed in that time. And I was just so fascinated and impressed with the way in which this gave birth for you to a more universalist sense of commitment against, about the human dignity of all peoples. And I'm wondering if you have any thoughts or reflections on that, because of course we were just speaking about what's happening in Palestine now, and there are a lot of people from your kind of community or background who maybe wouldn't have taken the same approach, um, and developed the same kind of political consciousness that you have. And so I'm wondering how you feel about that, and if you have any final thoughts about what it was like, growing up as you know, a minority group in the U.S. that at the time was really excluded, and where there really was very serious, racism directed against Jews in the United States.
Well, the first thing that comes to my mind is that I know what anti-Semitism is. It's not what our president thinks it is or wants to tell us it is. I mean, I lived at a time as a child, even as a child, where I was excluded from different things because I was Jewish, and so on. And so I really have a clear idea of what anti-Semitism is, and I have a clear idea of the anti-Semitism of our leaders today. And they think they can wash it away, they can't. uh, it's it's a difficult subject, and I saw it. I would go every day to the demonstrations at Columbia University,
Mm.
and what I saw was political action and responsible political action, not anti-Semitism. There was none of it, and it was. It, it's terrible what I've seen now of universities sort of kneeling to the administration. And I'm sure that uh, a lot of us are very ashamed of them. Yes, and I, it's a hard subject for me, but as I say, I grew up at a time when anti-Semitism was very much out in the open. That was, I mean, the scout leader didn't let me join the troops, and she said, "No Jews allowed." I mean, it was as simple as that. And for a child that has a lifelong import, yeah, it's hard to talk about, but
Well,
at the
yeah,
same time. I guess we must. And at any rate, what I see today is that Jews are many Jews are standing up for Palestine. Here in the United States, there's a tremendous swell of pro-Palestinian sentiment, and I will finish by organizing demonstrations and so on, and standing up and screaming. But it is difficult. It is difficult. Yeah,
yeah,
but many Jews have a clear idea of what's going on. Yeah,
absolutely, absolutely, yes. Well, again, Elaine, I really want to thank you for sharing all of these, not just reminiscences, but your analysis about the world, and even about how it's relevant to our time and your reflections on continuing the struggle today. I think it's very important for people to recognize and realize, this history took place, and that there's the possibility maybe to reforge some of those global alliances and connections of people seeking freedom and struggling for liberation. Your example is, I think, very inspirational to people. I'm so glad that you shared it in a book. I know many people asked you to write it and you finally got set down to write your story. But it's a beautiful and wonderful book. And I would encourage all of the listeners and viewers to go out and get a copy and read it. Algiers, Third World Capital, Freedom Fighters, Revolutionaries, Black Panthers. And again, it's just been a real pleasure to meet you and to have the benefit of your experience and wisdom. So thank you so much for taking the time to talk with me today.
a pleasure. Thank you.
Listeners, tune in again. We have lots of content like this. This has been a particularly special episode, I think, but we have a lot of other discussions and with scholars and activists. So do tune in. And until next time, peace and solidarity to you all.
Solidarity. Solidarity. Those are the words.